My name is Tom Kinski, and I am the vice chair of the Boston Grotto, a caving club affiliated with the National Speleological Society. We meet the first Wednesday of every month on MIT campus and regularly send out open invitations in the hopes of attracting new members. There are always people who show up interested. I'd like to think this wasn't just due to the pizza we order in from the upper crust on Charles Street. But who am I kidding? Everyone loves pizza. The Boston Grotto also organizes yearly caving trips to some fascinating, flung places. Last summer, we planned a deep cave expedition in the karstic limestone plateau of southern Turkey. We actually helped to map out the lower reaches of the cave system, extending the depth of the Morka cave from 919 meters to 1240 meters. It is now officially the third deepest cave in Turkey, all thanks to our hard work and dedication. It's a very, very fulfilling hobby, but caving is neither easy, nor is it really relaxing. In fact, on occasion, caving can be hazardous, terrifying, or even fatal. I have plenty of stories detailing brushes with the danger of death, but the one I'm about to tell you is one that sticks with me the most. So, a few years back, a ranger from the Glacier National Park in Montana got in touch with the NSS regarding a previously unexplored cave system. Christy Starr, the office manager of the NSS, then referred the ranger to us due to our expertise in mapping out unexplored sections of cave systems. The ranger then got in touch with the Boston Grotto, and then basically offered us an all-expense paid caving trip to the Glacier National Park. Needless to say, we were ecstatic. You see, whether we're talking about Francis Dark, Magellan, or even Lewis and Clark, we can conclude the most, if not all, of the Earth's surface has been thoroughly documented and mapped out. There is very little in the way of land left to explore, but the same cannot be said for what lies beneath our feet. The National Speleological Society alone estimates that only 10 to 15% of the world's cave systems have been documented and mapped out. I'm not sure people realize just what an opportunity that presents people like us. We have the chance to explore places that no man or woman has ever stepped foot in before, to truly be the next generation of explorers, carrying the torch in place of ancient sailors, 19th century African adventurers, or even the space-faring astronauts of the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's very real possibility of being able to name something the Kinski Caves, or something along those lines. The very real possibility that some of us could be immortalized in the way that Stanley or Abbott have been, giving their names to Port Stanley in Africa or in British India. And so it was that myself and two other members of the Boston Grotto ended up driving all the way out to Montana in a van filled with caving gear, snacks, and beer. Given that the drive took a couple of days, we made something of a road trip out of it, stopping off at Chicago to stretch our legs and take in the sights of the Windy City. Accompanying me on a trip was Paul Hutchinson, coordinator of experience-based training here at Boston University, and another member of the Grotto, Nestor Ramos, previously employed by Lynchburg College, Virginia. Hutch had expanded the outdoor leadership program to include backpacking, rock climbing, horizontal caving, vertical caving, and canoeing, as well as creating an academic minor in outdoor recreation. To others, caving and other outdoor activities were just a hobby, but for Hutch, it was more of a vocation, something he was compelled to do, something that was in his blood, and he brought that same passion to almost everything he did. Nestor, on the other hand, was a relatively new member of the Grotto, but what he lacked in raw experience, he made up for in enthusiasm and competence. He was a natural in ways that made the very younger me very envious. After almost 5 whole days worth of driving, we finally made it to Browning, Montana. We stopped to get a bite to eat, and then headed further down Highway 2 until we reached where we'd be staying, the Traveler's Rest Lodge, a set of log cabins that were very bit as charming as rustic as I had imagined. We slept like the dead that night, and after sleeping in a van for 4 nights, I had never been so appreciative of the divine human invention that is the mattress. The next morning came, and the trip out to Glacier Park itself. We packed up our gear, which included our very specialized helmets, lights, thin, comfortable, with a 4-point suspension that will stay on in a fall, as well as being safe to mount batteries, flashlights, and brackets too. We threw extra batteries and flashlights into small utility backpacks, along with extra layers of warm clothing, as well as food and water. But then came perhaps the coolest part of the trip so far. Given that the Glacier National Park is pretty much inaccessible to anyone but experienced hikers, the rangers out there had planned something a little special for us to save us exhausting ourselves before the exploration even began. A helicopter ride into the park itself. We were told to be in a certain field at a certain time, which we were, and seeing that chopper coming in from a distance, the thudding of its rotor blades shattering the early morning tranquility, it was just incredible. I'm a huge fan of old war movies, and if it wasn't so chilly that morning, it might have felt like we were back in Vietnam or something. Special forced guys being airlifted behind enemy lines or something. Despite being ferried deep into the national park via helicopter, finding a safe place to drop us off was another thing entirely. We landed about a mile's hike from the cave system itself, with one of the rangers guiding us up a set of steep paths which led to the tiny, restrictive entrance on a mountainside. We arranged a call-out time of 8:30 that evening, enough time for us to get out of the cave and back down the mountain to the landing site before sunset. After that, the park ranger let us hike back down to the chopper, and our journey began in earnest. I immediately understood why the cave system was previously unexplored. The entrance was barely traversable, even to us experienced cavers, and more than once, I had to completely exhale to make my torso fit through the narrow gaps. Hutch was the point man as he headed in, and each little cranny he had to shimmy through was properly assessed for danger. A larger man might have become stuck to suffer the same fate as that guy in Utah about 10 years earlier, something I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. After about a half hour of serious anxiety that verged on claustrophobia, the tunnels began to open up a little, and I really do mean a little. They were still narrow enough that we could do nothing but crawl on our hands and knees, occasionally just our bellies, in order to get deeper inside a place that, apparently, no man or woman had tread before. It was terrifying, but thrilling in a way that I didn't think I could put into words. It's like one long burst of adrenaline, knowing you're the vanguard of subterranean exploration, and you can almost feel it buzzing in your fingertips. So the last thing I was expecting when we found ourselves crawling into a larger, more open cave was to hear Hutch's disappointment. As you can imagine, you can't make loud noises in a cave system. You have to be as quiet as possible, given that reverberations and echoes can quite easily cause a cave-in if the rock isn't of a certain density. So at first, I couldn't quite make out what Hutch was getting at. I mean, I seriously thought he was injured, or something at first. He started hissing and whispering curses, balling his fist in frustration at something he'd seen illuminated by the lamp on his helmet. After he crawled through, I watched him sit down, leaning back against a cave wall with his face obscured by his hands. I asked him what the matter was, but he just shook his head, a melancholy to his body language that I'd rarely seen before, as he pointed to the opposite side of the cave. There, lying on the cold stone floor, was a burlap sack, a small leather-bound notebook sitting just nearby. Only then did I join him against the cave wall, sorely lamenting the fact that this wasn't going to be the Virgin expedition that we imagined it to be. But that didn't mean we were about ready to give up. Not by a long shot. Whoever had been down in this place previously had officially and obviously never recorded their findings. so the door for us to map out and name the place was still very much a possibility. But before we pushed on, we decided to search the burlap sack and inspect the small book for clues as to what we might be up against as we moved deeper. As I nicked open the sack, I could see there were remains of some old food container, along with an old-style water flask, both of which were empty. They looked old, extremely old, and I hurried to inspect the small book to see if it had any trace of a date inside. The thing fell apart in my hands, moisture and time having long eroded the pages and bindings, but we did find a page where the date was partially legible. It read 1860 something, the last number completely worn away by the damp cave air. The book had been sitting down there for the better part of 200 years, and although we couldn't read a single full sentence of what was written in it, I'd have given anything to know what the cavers of yore thought of their subterranean experiences. As we advanced further into the cave system, I couldn't help but wonder just what would cause an explorer to just abandon their notebook like that. But we soon discovered the reason. 2 caves over, we found them. Hutch called it out as soon as the beam of his headlamp passed over the dome of rib bones that jutted out from the rock. It was nothing short of terrifying, knowing they'd come down here one day, never to return, never to see their loved ones again, and all the while the reasoning for being down here eluded us. After that, here were 3 things we saw before we turned tail and got out of there. The first were the skeleton's finger bones. Basically, a person's finger bone is divided up into 3 distinct sections, the smallest sections being at a person's fingertip. These have a pretty distinct shape. Go ahead and Google it, and you'll see what I mean. So it was pretty evident to us that something traumatic had occurred that wore the tips of the bones away. It felt intensely creepy, speculating how this guy had potentially lost his way in the caves, gone mad as a result of the deprivation and darkness, and began to scratch at the walls of the cave until his fingers had worn down to the bone. And even then, he hadn't stopped scratching. But we couldn't find any sections of the cave wall that bore the marks he would have made, which led us to the second thing we saw before we got the hell out of there. It was his skull. There were scratch marks on his skull, right around the orbital sockets. None of us said a thing about it as we studied the yellowing bone under our headlamps, because it was obvious what had occurred here. Down in the dark, almost 200 years before, he had scratched out his own eyes. We were already backing the cave out at this point, praying we wouldn't get lost on the way back, as this poor soul had obviously done. I tried not to think about the moment that the poor soul's lamplight had run out, condemning him to spend what little time he had left in absolute darkness. I tried to show Hutch and Nestor, but they weren't in the least bit interested in hanging around any longer. And to be honest, I totally understood why. As we sat around the open field we landed at, waiting for our helicopter taxi to arrive, we agreed not to talk about what we'd seen until we got back to Boston. There was a good chance that if we told the Rangers what we'd seen, they'd ask us to go back in and retrieve the body of the old caver, something none of us were particularly keen to do. And as much as we agreed not to talk about it until we got back home, there never did come a time when we discussed what we'd seen down there, ever. I mean, when the Rangers asked us how the caving had gone, we just told them it was unsafe to be down there, and there was no chance of turning the cave system into a tourist trap, let alone a place for experienced cavers to go when they wanted a challenge. I suppose I've waited a long time to get this whole thing off my chest, so now I suppose everyone knows about the body down there in the caves of Glacier National Park.